Join me in welcoming Mr. Kinzer.
Wow, what a lot of energy in that young staff. I'm so impressed, and they're playing off the energy that's in this room. This is a room that's so full of potential, and that potential is going to be realized thanks to this organization. So it's really an exciting moment for me to be able to be here and help kick off what I think is going to be a very productive few days in the history of U.S.-Iran relations. Actually, I come to Washington as little as possible. I don't like coming here. The reason is that in Washington, the spectrum of acceptable opinions on foreign policy is exceedingly narrow. In order to participate in legitimate discussion on the United States and its role in the world, you have to accept 100 different assumptions about who we are and what we should be doing. If you don't accept all 100 of those, you're considered to be some kind of a wacko who doesn't deserve to be invited to lunch in this town. Any hint of original thinking in foreign policy is treated as if it's the germ of a frightful plague that must be immediately stamped out before it begins to infect the whole foreign policy process. Therefore, based on this deep love for Washington that I've just outlined, what brought me here? What got me onto the plane? Well, it's probably my favorite four-letter word after maybe love, and that is NIAC. NIAC is what brought me to the airport and brought me here, and I think it's what brought all of you here. We're living in a distressing moment in the history of our own republic. In the short space of my own lifetime, and of course I think of that as being very short, the level of democracy in this country has clearly declined. This is a less democratic country than it was at the time when I was born. That's very distressing. All of us are trying to do our little bit. I try to beat my spoon on the high chair every now and then and do whatever kind of tantrum throwing I can. But there's a very low limit on what an individual can do to affect the political process. And actually, that's one of the reasons that the political process has been progressing the way it has, is to continue to limit and restrict and lessen the ability of citizens to affect the political process. In order to overcome that, in order to have effect, you can't be isolated. You need an instrument that can bring you together and multiply your effect. And that is exactly what NIAC does. Please understand that this is the only organization that is engaged in this struggle here in Washington. If you believe that the United States government needs to be pushed in the direction of reconciliation with Iran, NIAC is the only game in town. This is our vessel, and what a wonderful vessel it is. We're lucky to have this, and it's a thrill to see so many of you people recognizing that collective action is the way we are going to change this political policy. And I see that NIAC is not only well-placed to achieve this in the future. NIAC has already achieved this. NIAC has already changed the terms of debate on this issue. No other organization has done it. It's been the result of painstaking, ground-level, grain of sand by grain of sand work by NIAC and its great staff. And this is a very frustrating process. I could never get involved in it. It would drive me nuts to have to deal with the people and the ignorance that NIAC has to deal with every day. You're about to get in your first session this afternoon an example that not every member of Congress is so ignorant. Nonetheless, those of you that are participating on Monday probably will understand where many of these members of Congress are coming from. And they are the ones that can't find Iran on a outline map. However, we have not yet adopted in Congress the rule that I would like to propose, which is that you cannot support the bombing, invasion, or occupation of any country that you can't find on a map. Now, the process of trying to change America's approach to Iran is not an open-ended one. You know, NIAC's been working on this for a period of years now, and will be working on it indefinitely in the future. But the process that we're involved in now is not open-ended. We are at a crucial moment. We are at the moment of decision now. In these months, crucial steps are going to be taken that are going to shape the long-term history of U.S.-Iran relations. And that's why being here at this moment is so important. The clock is ticking down on this presidency. The next president, whoever it is, will be more aggressive, more hostile, more ignorant, less willing to pursue this project. Therefore, it's so important that we concentrate our energies now. And that's why NIAC has brought us all here together. So your presence here right now is probably more important than anyone's presence at a NIAC event at any point in the past. This is the moment. Now, it's also an important moment for the United States suddenly in the Middle East as we face a whole new set of challenges that weren't even existing or on our radar screen when we had our last conference. To me, the current situation is an opportunity to point out what is the real geopolitics of the Middle East, not the fantasy geopolitics that people have had drilled into them by lobbies and that have accepted only out of their own ignorance. The fact is that the United States is now facing a new threat, which is also a threat to Iran. In fact, it's certainly more of a threat to Iran than it is to us. We're in a near panic. But this threat that we're facing from new groups in the Middle East is much more threatening to Iran than it is to us. They are eager, even more eager than we are as a nation, to engage in this fight. Now, the United States has made clear that we have taken the idea of ISIS as an enemy very seriously. But we recognize that we cannot defeat this threat militarily. The United States Army is not equipped to do something like wipe out that group. We can't do it ourselves. If we can't do it with our military means, we have an even greater obligation to use every diplomatic and political tool available to us to build the coalition that can crush this threat. But we're not doing that. Effectively, we are fighting with one hand behind our back because we are refusing to engage the other people in the Middle East who actually know that region and share with us a long-term strategic goal. We have decided that although the threat from ISIS is great, it's not so great that we should fight it at all costs. We've decided at some level that any project in the Middle East, even if it's the crushing of ISIS, is not worth anything that will bring us closer to Iran or that will increase Iran's standing. But in fact, we have some great fundamental issues in common with Iran. The fight against ISIS brings this very vividly to the surface. One of the great threats to world stability now is ungoverned areas, places that aren't under the control of any central government. Iran shares with the United States the fundamental principle that every square inch of land on earth should be under the control of an established state. It doesn't matter. Later on, you can argue about what kind of a state. But ungoverned states are the great enemy. Iran is on our side on this. I argue for U.S.-Iran reconciliation mainly from the position of an American. The only long-term, real, fundamental, lasting basis for global security is when countries seriously and consciously pursue their own long-term interests. I'm all for America doing what's good for the United States. Nobody else is going to do what's good for the United States, so we should. But let's think seriously about what's really good for us over the long run and not take steps that make us feel good for a few minutes, but actually bring great tragedy down on us over the long run. Our short-term thinking has gotten us into this problem in the Middle East. So for the United States, partnership with Iran will allow us not only to fight immediate enemies, but to engage on great issues that are of huge importance to us. Iran considers its number one geostrategic threat to be radical militancy of the al-Qaeda, ISIS sort. And their number two national security threat, they always say this, is environmental disaster, which is overwhelming Iran. Neither of these are problems that Iran can resolve itself, and they both happen to be problems that are urgently important to the United States. So we're now at a moment where partnership with Iran makes more and more sense in the immediate term, as well as over the long term. It's important, I hope, that when you're on Capitol Hill, you can try to speak from this perspective. I'm only talking about what's good for us. This is not a giveaway to another country. Better relations with the United States, with Iran, is probably the best step the United States could take anywhere in the world to increase our long-term strategic power. Our power waned and drained so much as a result of our invasion of Iraq. We lost so much strategic power because of that. And the situation we are facing in the Middle East now is a direct result of that invasion. We see how one disastrous mistake made in Washington can have such long-term ripple effects. Now, in the coming months, great decisions are going to be made on Capitol Hill. When you are up there, please try to make clear to your members of Congress and the other people with whom you're speaking that there is no negative downside for the United States in reconciliation with Iran. Why do we believe that there is? Why is there such continuing hostility towards Iran and towards the idea of U.S.-Iran reconciliation? I think the fundamental reason is that the Americans, and to a large extent the Iranians as well, are caught in the grip of emotions. Emotion is always the enemy of wise statesmanship. We need to overcome emotional stereotypes and allow Americans to see the reality of the geopolitics in the Middle East. Iran sets off a series of false images in people's minds. It's our job to try to correct those and to try to point out that the United States is the logical partner for the United States in that part of the world. I am hoping this could result not only in a reduction of tensions between Tehran and Washington, not only closer cooperation in great regional problems, but also a gradual opening of society inside Iran, so that the next Iranian woman who wins the Field Medal as the world's greatest mathematician will be someone who's actually living and working in Iran and didn't feel the need to emigrate to have research possibilities somewhere else. I'm looking forward to an Iran where someone like my dear friend Jason Rezaian is not going to be sitting in a jail for no reason for months, not to mention all those other people who are sitting in the same jails for the same lack of reasons who I don't happen to know. It's so important for the development of human rights inside Iran that the United States and Iran come closer together. This constant tension feeds the factions inside Iran that want to continue repression of civil society. Our sanctions on Iran are enriching the Revolutionary Guard, which is the most repressive and reactionary group in that country. Without the sanctions and the sanctions-busting income that's coming into the Revolutionary Guards, that institution couldn't be doing what it's doing now. So our policy is not only failing to promote our own interests, but it is undermining the human rights project inside Iran, which we claim to be supporting. Now, American engagement with Iranian democracy is nothing new. NIAC has picked up a standard that other Americans have carried before. I'm about to lead a tour to Iran in May. And when I was approached by the tour agency, they asked me if I would do this. First of all, I knew I wanted to say yes because that's the only way I can get in these days. But I had a special request. There's one place in Iran I've never been to that I always wanted to go to. So I asked the tour operator, can you arrange for us to make a stop in Tabriz? And they have done that. They have changed the tour. That was my condition. I wanted to go to Tabriz. Now, one reason is that Tabriz is an interesting city. It's always been the entry port, actually, for modern ideas. It was on the border with Russia and Turkey, of course, so particularly interesting spot. But I have a particular reason to want to go to Tabriz. And I have a particular reason to want to bring my tour group, which will be made up, I presume, mainly of Americans, to Tabriz. And I'm going to prepare them for this in the days before. I'm going to make this the highlight of our trip. What I want to do in Tabriz is visit the grave of Howard Baskerville, the American hero who gave his life for the cause of Iranian democracy. I don't want to do it in a way that's going to be provocative and big songs and wreaths, but as an American who is concerned with democracy in Iran and with the relationship between Iranian people and American people, I've always felt my failure to have gone to Howard Baskerville's grave as a big hole. I managed to get to Mossadegh's house, but now I want to stand in front of Baskerville's grave. To me, he is the symbol of the blood tie that binds Americans and Iranians in the cause of democracy. And that's why when you go up to Capitol Hill on Monday, I hope you proudly think of yourselves as part not only of NIAC, but of the NIAC Howard Baskerville Brigade. Congratulations. Thank you. Great. Thank you. I've been told that I'm allowed to take a couple of questions. If anybody has anything they'd like to ask, please feel free to do so. This is your chance. Right here.
Steve, thank you very much for being here. The question I have, do you see only a lack of education for Congress, or is that some other reason behind it, that they don't want to have that?
I don't think it's only ignorance. I'd like to say it was just natural ignorance because that's easier to overcome. There's no doubt that you are confronting other powerful lobbies. You're not just going into an open area where people don't know anything and are open to being educated. In fact, you're something like the mouse that roared in this room. You are facing some very powerful lobbies. And I think that is another reason to be so excited about this concentration of energy in this room. This community didn't always have this. And it was NIAC, to a large degree, that brought this community together and made it into a politically active community. It still hasn't reached the level of many other communities. It's got a long way to go. But if you are suggesting that there are powerful forces feeding the ignorance, I think you're absolutely right. And that makes our work all the more important. We don't have to go into this project in a combative mood, but I think in the back of our minds we have to understand that the person that was in this office just before I came in, or the one who's going to come in after me, is going to have a very different narrative. And simply providing nice facts isn't enough. You have to understand the counter-narrative. And that's why in my own conversations with members of Congress and other people in the policy community, I always come back to what's good for us. This is a project that will advance the national security of the United States in an area where that security is now suddenly more intensely threatened than ever. This is the step we can take to defend ourselves. And if other lobbies are warning that reconciliation with Iran is a trap, a way to weaken us, it's our job to point out the ways in which this reconciliation serves the security interests of the United States. We shouldn't be subcontracting our foreign policy to any other country. And I think that should be your message.
Thank you. Thank you. One question. What's the benefit to average American to have a relationship between Iran and America?
You don't want to see the next journalist in an orange suit get beheaded? And everything else that can spin from that? Those people who did that, they don't like Americans, I can tell. But it's not like the way they feel about Iranians. They are based on the principle of murdering every 12er Shiite in the world. Is this not a motivation for Iran to want to become active? And are we not taking advantage of the passion that exists in that community? So I think the most immediate advantage to the United States is we need an ally. We need some friends in that part of the world. Our so-called friends have been stabbing us in the back. This situation that we're facing in the Middle East was created by our friends with our cooperation. It's time for us to rethink who our friends really are, whose long-term strategic interests are closer to ours, and whose long-term strategic interests actually conflict with ours. So I think that's the short term. We're in an emergency situation, and in fact, I sometimes think the anger at Obama is based in part on the fact that he's not panicking. We want him to go crazy and say the end of the world is at hand. He's not doing that. Good for him. But after we get a handle on this immediate situation, we have a long-term problem of huge instability in the Middle East. Oddly enough, Iran is an island of stability in the turbulence of the Middle East. Iran is certainly not where we would like it to be in many ways, but Iran has the possibility to evolve. Any nation does. There's a very real scenario you could draw where in the future Iran would evolve and America would evolve to a point where we could cooperate on many issues. There is no way you can imagine that ISIS will somehow evolve into an entity that we can deal with. So we are facing a choice. Do we want to look for allies in that part of the world? Do we want to go there and say, raise your hands if you really want to fight ISIS? And if you raise your hand, we want you. We're not doing that. We're saying, okay, you've raised your hand, but we're going to check on our list to see if you're vetted, if you're all right. As long as we're doing this, we're not really fighting. We're fighting with one hand behind our back. And it's not fair to tell the American people that we're doing everything we can to face the new emergency in the Middle East, because we're not. And I think that is an argument that we can easily sell in Congress. How serious is this? If you think it's really serious, then we should be fighting with all the weapons at our disposal. The greatest weapons we have are political and diplomatic, but we're not using them. And Iran is the repository of some of those most important political weapons. Right here.
I can. Thank you very much. The question I have for you is that what happens to the role of the military? The American military that has been at odds with Iran, and they consider that the Iranians have a lot of Americans on their hands on what went on in Iraq and what have you. So how do we bring the military or some of those brass along the line to as we want to do with the Congress, how do we do that with the military? Thank you.
I have found some senior members of the military remarkably ignorant on this issue. We saw one of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff make some quite ignorant statements in the last week or two, essentially saying that Iran is a bigger threat to the United States than ISIS. But actually, I don't consider the military to be the chief obstacle. I believe our obstacle is in politics. I believe our obstacle is in the system of legalized bribery that we call campaign contributions and the way the U.S. Congress has been constituted. It's part of the weakening of our democracy. Our challenge is not so much to convert people in uniform. Our challenge is to, in a narrower sense, to persuade policymakers to open their minds to realism and not be caught in the grip of cliches. But I hope we can use this as a stepping stone to try to crack open a little bit the closing nut of our political system that is more and more impervious to citizen action. So I feel that it's our policymakers, not our military, that is the real obstacle. And that's why it's so wonderful that the focus of this conference is not just talking to each other, but it's talking to each other to find out exactly what we want to say and then going to Capitol Hill and the policy community and saying it. Here is a way to organize our complaints and our arguments. So frankly, if I only had to worry about attitudes in the military, I'd be a lot less worried than I am now. I've spent a fair amount of time at West Point. I can tell you, the degree of thoughtful introspection that goes on, not only among the faculty, but among the Corps of Cadets, is far superior to what you're getting anywhere in Washington. I would be more than happy to choose the U.S. Congress from the Corps of Cadets. than what the Congress that we have now. You'd get a much less militaristic Congress, I'm telling you, because these people really understand war. But frankly, if I could choose the members of Congress from any group, I'd like to choose them from the ones right here in this room. Okay, have we got time for, go ahead.
Hold on one moment.
First of all, thank you for your contributions to Iranian-American history. Secondly, as you mentioned, Washington is not America. When you travel around America, do you see a more pragmatic attitude, particularly when you talk to business leaders, states, politicians, and so on? Because
yes, I do. I really do. Particularly among business leaders. Business leaders are looking at reality. Politicians are living in a kind of a miasma of unreality. In business, something's either going to work or it's not going to work. You have to make a choice. You can't get caught up in your emotions. The bottom line will betray you. So I think many business leaders tend to be more analytical, and they don't come into big decisions with heavy amounts of baggage. They come in with a more open mind. That's another community from which maybe we would want to recruit some more members of Congress. I do think that the anti-Iran intensity in the American public has definitely receded over the last decade or so. The cowboys against Iranians idea and the whole hangover of the hostage crisis, I really think has begun to fade, except here in Washington. And I sense that there is a curiosity about Iran. To a certain degree, I think people are getting to feel the way they started to feel about our embargo against Cuba. It just went on, and after a while, people began to ask, why? Why are we doing this? That was a policy that seemed to make sense when it started, but it took on a life of its own. Our great hope is to make sure that the hostility between the U.S. and Havana does not end before the hostility between the U.S. and Tehran. Yeah, over there.
So if you were an advisor to President Obama or any president, how would you advise him to overcome the obstacle of various vested interests in the region? I mean, namely the Israelis, the Saudis, and all the regional rivalries that prevent normalization of relations between the two countries?
Well, that is a very deep question that gets right to the heart of matters. And that's why, in a sense, I see the current political crisis in the Middle East as having at least this one positive aspect. Because here is a way where we can make clearer to thinking people that we're facing a crisis caused by people who posed as our friends. Now, we need to ask ourselves who our real friends are in that part of the world. And if you look back on the history of our hostility with Cuba, there never was a moment when suddenly we decided, we don't like Cuba, but we need them now. That never happened. But that moment has come with Iran. So I'm thinking that this horrific crisis that we now face with this bloodthirsty group that has so cleverly and intentionally pushed all of our buttons and made us crazy, actually is an opportunity for those who want to explain how wrong we got the geopolitics of that part of the world. Now, I would like to start with some projects of cooperation between the U.S. and Iran that are off the political table. How are we ever going to cooperate with them on the nuclear issue, for example, or on military security? Those are very complicated problems. But there are many problems we have in common. I mentioned environmental concerns, but here's one that I always have in mind as a huge problem for America and a huge, even bigger problem for Iran that we're both very concerned about and don't know what to do about, and that's opium, heroin. We're having an epidemic in this country, and we're starting to see a little bit of what's happening in Iran. The Iranians are on the front line of this battle. All that opium that's coming from Afghanistan, it's all coming across Iran. It used to be that it would just go through. Now, so much of it is leaking out in Iran, and as you all know, this has become a terrible problem in Iran. We're trying to stop the flow of Afghan heroin out of Afghanistan. So is Iran. And Iran has lost hundreds of soldiers and border policemen in fights with drug gangs. Here, to me, is a great example of a project on which the U.S. and Iran could collaborate. It's not political, but it addresses a big crisis that we both have. It's a way of building trust. Now, in the previous administration, they had a very firm concept about confidence-building measures with Iran. They were explicitly opposed to them. They used that phrase, we don't want any confidence-building measures with Iran. But that's the absolute opposite of a policy that brings long-term security to the United States. Confidence-building measures are exactly what we do need. So I would like to start with some projects that we could get involved in even before we resolve the bigger ones as stepping stones. Let's try to show each other that we're not the monsters that we're perceived to be. And I think some kind of a project like this is a great way to start. Shall we go back into the corner there?
Thank you, Mr. Kinzer. This issue is deeply personal to me because from 2006 to 2007, I was in Iraq. And I've seen Iraqis and Americans be killed by Iranian weapons and by having put certain Iranians in jail. With that said, I'm still about peace. So my question is this. What role do you see Ayatollah Sistani playing in all this? Because when we were there, he actually helped quell a lot of our violence during the sectarian violence in 2006. But I don't hear a lot of his name being brought up today. I know he disengages from politics. He's different than the Ayatollah Khamenei, but wondering what you would think his role should be in this, because he is a major player. He's one of the most revered Ayatollahs in the Shia religion. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me comment on your observation. I think you're absolutely correct. You're not distorting what happened in Iraq. It did happen. Let's face it. Iran was helping our enemies in Iraq. Now, they would say that's because you were never supposed to be there in the first place. And, of course, there's a huge sectarian connection between Iran and Iraq. Nonetheless, if that history has left a bad taste in the mouth of Americans, I understand. It should have. I get it. I understand that. I can see the situation from Iran's point of view. But it is true that Iran was helping groups that were fighting against and killing Americans who were part of the occupation force in Iraq. And that's a reality. Now, actually, we want them to go into Iraq and help kill some other people. I actually think that Ayatollah Sistani can play an important role, and I think he's already beginning to do so. He had the chance to denounce American bombing, the beginnings of American involvement in this last couple of weeks, and he didn't do that. In fact, he issued a statement that seemed relatively positive. So I see him as a very hopeful figure, a very positive figure, and possibly even if he emerges as a person in whom we feel we can have some trust, he could even be a bridge to the Shiite clergy and mullahs in Iran. So I hope he does have a positive role, and I think there's a real possibility of that. You know, we just heard that warning about how we need to stay on time, and I don't want to be the American who drags us onto Iranian time. So with that, let me just thank you so much for the chance to be here. It's energized me. I'm ready to come back next year. Go get them! Thank you all. It's great to be here. Great. Thank you.